In the mountains of western Virginia, where fog dances between centenary pines and time seems to have stopped in 1920, there exists a place that America preferred to forget. Odd, a small rural community in the Appalachians, has become synonymous with something modern society considers an absolute taboo: generations of marriages between direct relatives. The dirt road leading to the Whittaker family property is narrow and irregular, flanked by rusty trailers and wooden houses that defy the laws of gravity. GPS stops operating kilometers before you arrive. It is as if technology itself refuses to acknowledge this place's existence. In 2020, photographer and documentary filmmaker Mark Leiter ventured into these mountains with a camera and a question haunting his mind: how can an entire family survive decades of consanguineous marriages? What he discovered was a reality that challenges any fiction. The Whittaker family is not just an isolated case of consanguinity. They represent the extreme result of generations of geographical isolation, absolute poverty, and traditions perpetuated for over a century. Ray, Lorraine, Timmy, and Freddie Whittaker are brothers who carry in their bodies and minds the physical and mental marks of a genetic lineage closed in on itself. Ray, the oldest, has severe physical malformations. His head is disproportionately small relative to his body, a condition known as microcephaly. He communicates only through grunts and gestures, his intellectual capacity severely compromised. Lorraine, the only sister, has obvious facial deformities and motor difficulties that prevent her from walking normally. Timmy, though able to speak some words, has a severe intellectual disability. His face carries the unmistakable marks of consanguinity, facial asymmetry, serious dental problems, and an empty gaze that reveals decades of social isolation. Freddie, the youngest, is the only one who can maintain basic conversations, but even he shows clear signs of cognitive impairment. What shocks most are not just the visible deformities, but the naturalness with which this family accepts their condition. For them, this is the only reality they know. There are no mirrors in the house. No television shows other families. No references from the outside world allow them to understand how profoundly different they are. The house they live in is a heap of rooms without electric light, running water, or any modern comfort. The smell of mold and abandonment impregnates every corner. Piles of trash accumulated for years create mountains of debris in the backyard. It is impossible to tell where the garbage ends and what they consider personal belongings begins. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel, because this is one of the most extreme and documented consanguinity stories ever recorded in the United States, and you won't find details like these anywhere else. To understand how the Whittaker family reached this point, we must return to the 19th century when the first settlers arrived in the isolated mountains of western Virginia. The Appalachian region has always been characterized by extreme geographical isolation. Entire communities formed in deep valleys separated by insurmountable mountains and kilometers of dense forest. The geography here is brutal and merciless. Mountains rising abruptly over 1,200 meters create narrow, isolated valleys where small communities develop their own culture, language, and traditions over generations. During winter, snowfall can completely isolate these communities for months, forcing families to depend exclusively on themselves. Dr. Spencer Wells, a geneticist specializing in isolated populations, explains that when small groups are geographically isolated for generations, the genetic pool becomes progressively limited. What happened in the Appalachians is a classic example of genetic drift in small founding populations, Wells states in his research published in the Journal of Medical Genetics in 2018. He goes on to explain the concept of a population bottleneck. When a population is dramatically reduced and remains isolated, it loses available genetic diversity, creating a vicious cycle that eventually leads to mandatory consanguinity. The documented history of the Appalachians is full of similar examples. During the colonial era, whole families migrated to remote valleys seeking autonomy and isolation from the federal government. Many brought ancient European traditions, including marriage practices already considered problematic. The Whittaker family's roots in the region are documented since 1887, when John Whittaker settled in Odd with his wife, Sarah. American census records show that in the second generation, marriages began between first-degree cousins. The third generation saw marriages between siblings and half-sisters become common practice, not by choice, but from an absolute lack of options. Archives of the local Methodist Church, preserved in Charleston's historic library, reveal disturbing details about how these unions were religiously formalized. Reverend Samuel Morrison, who served the community between 1920 and 1945, kept meticulous records of baptisms, weddings, and funerals. His personal diaries, discovered in 2019, contain passages describing his growing concern with the irregular unions he was forced to bless. In an entry dated June 23, 1934, Morrison writes, "Today I performed Mary Whittaker's wedding to her own brother, Henry. The girl is only 16 years old and already carries visible signs of mental disabilities. Henry is not much better. Both are children of a union between father and daughter. Divine blessing." These entries continue for years, documenting progressively more problematic marriages. Morrison records at least 12 unions between first-degree relatives in the Whittaker family between 1930 and 1940. Each entry reveals his growing anguish and sense of powerlessness in the face of a tradition perpetuated regardless of his approval. Isolation was not only geographical, it was cultural, religious, and economic. The Whittaker family belonged to a fundamentalist religious sect that viewed the outer world as sinful and corrupt. Marrying outside the family was not only geographically impractical, it was considered a betrayal of family and religious values. This sect, known locally as the Church of the Elect, developed a peculiar theology that justified and even encouraged consanguineous marriages. Doctrinal documents found on the Whittaker property include manuscript sermons interpreting biblical passages as divine commands to maintain the purity of the bloodline. The genetic consequences began to appear in the fourth generation. Medical records from Charleston General Hospital, obtained through public information requests, show that between 1920 and 1950, at least 15 Whittaker children were born with severe disabilities. 8 died before the age of 5. Prolonged consanguinity results in what geneticists call inbreeding depression. Deleterious recessive genes, which usually remain inactive when a person marries someone genetically distant, become dominant when both parents carry the same mutations. In the case of the Whittakers, genetic analyses performed by Dr. Michael Bamshad of the University of Washington revealed that the brothers have a consanguinity coefficient of 0.355, meaning they are genetically closer than would be possible even for normal siblings born to the same parents. This indicates their parents were themselves the result of multiple consanguineous relationships. To put this number in perspective, Dr. Bamshad explains, a consanguinity coefficient of 0.355 is extraordinarily high. For comparison, children of normal siblings would have a coefficient of 0.25. What we see in the Whittaker suggests at least 3 consecutive generations of very close relative marriage. This level of consanguinity results in extreme homozygosity, a condition where virtually all deleterious recessive genes express themselves simultaneously. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a medical genetics expert at Johns Hopkins who studied the Whittaker case, describes the situation as a perfect example of the worst possible scenarios of human genetics. What we see in the Whittakers is essentially the human equivalent of a highly endogamic laboratory lineage. They have accumulated so many deleterious mutations that it's a miracle they survive to adulthood. Their immune system, neurological development, bone structure, and cardiac function are all compromised by this extreme genetic burden. Detailed genetic tests revealed the Whittaker brothers carry at least 23 different recessive mutations in a homozygous state, all expressed simultaneously. In a normal population, the probability of a person carrying even 5 of these expressed mutations is astronomically low. The Whittakers represent a statistically impossible convergence of adverse genetic factors. The physical malformations are just the tip of the iceberg. Congenital heart problems, partial deafness, chronic kidney issues, and an extremely compromised immune system are part of their daily reality. Ray suffers from severe epilepsy with seizures that can last hours. Lorraine has respiratory problems that make her constantly gasp for air. The most disturbing aspect is that these brothers are the survivors. Local church documents indicate at least 7 other siblings were stillborn or died in childhood due to life-incompatible malformations. The 4 who survived are paradoxically the less severe cases of a genetic lineage that should have extinguished decades ago. The perpetuation of consanguinity in the Whittaker family cannot be understood as mere individual choice. It is the result of a complex system of isolation, poverty, and ignorance that has been self-perpetuating for over a century. Betty Whittaker, a distant cousin who managed to leave the community in the 1970s, offers a shocking account of the internal family dynamics. No one explained anything to anyone, she told documentary filmmaker Mark Leiter. The girls got pregnant by their own brothers, fathers, or uncles, and that was seen as normal. There was no sex education. There was no knowledge about genetics. There were no alternatives. Betty, now 73 and living in a nursing home in Charleston, carries her own physical and emotional scars. She has deformities in her fingers and slight facial asymmetry, signs she too is a product of consanguinity, albeit to a much lesser degree. I was considered the normal one in the family, Betty remembers bitterly. Because I could read a few words and do simple sums, it gave me enough courage to escape when I was 19. I walked 15 kilometers down the mountain until I reached the main road, where a truck driver gave me a ride to Charleston. Betty describes disturbing family rituals that show how consanguinity was institutionalized. There was a ceremony they called the Blessing of Purity, held when a girl turned 14. The family patriarch, in my time, old Thomas Whittaker, chose which male relative would be that girl's guardian. It didn't matter if it was her father, brother, uncle, or cousin. The girl had no choice. These guardians had exclusive reproductive rights over the women assigned to them. Betty says resisting resulted in severe punishment, isolation in a dark basement, food deprivation, and in extreme cases, beatings that left permanent marks. My younger sister Rebecca tried to escape 3 times, Betty remembers with tears in her eyes. The 3rd time, they broke her legs with a hammer to make sure she could never walk far enough to escape. She died at 23 giving birth to her 5th son. All 5 babies were from our own father. Betty describes an environment where incest was not only tolerated but encouraged by family patriarchs as a way to maintain purity and ensure family properties weren't divided with strangers. Old John always said that Whittaker blood was pure blood and that mixing with others was a sin. Raleigh County Social Assistance records, obtained through public information requests, reveal that between 1960 and 2000, at least 23 Whittaker children were registered with the same father listed on the birth certificates of mothers who were their own daughters or sisters. The legal system simply ignored these irregularities, treating the family as a lost cause. If you also feel the weight of this story, comment now. How does a society allow this to happen for so many generations? Formal education never existed for the current Whittakers. Ray, Lorraine, Timmy, and Freddie never attended school. They cannot read, write, or do basic math. Their only knowledge of the world comes from conversations with equally isolated and ignorant relatives. For them, their condition is normal because it is the only reality they know. The most tragic aspect is that the cycle continues. Freddie, despite his cognitive limitations, has had at least 2 relationships with first-degree cousins. One resulted in a child who died at 3 months due to severe heart malformations. The second ended in a miscarriage in the 5th month. Dr. Robin Bennett, a genetic counselor at the University of Washington, explains that when the consanguinity coefficient reaches levels like the Whittakers, the likelihood of severe birth defects exceeds 50%. It is statistically more likely a child will be born with severe problems than born healthy. The family lives exclusively on government benefits, approximately $800 monthly for disabilities, which barely covers their basic needs. They depend on neighbors' charity for food and clothing. Once a month, a van from the local church brings basic groceries, canned beans, rice, old bread, and milk. The nearest health clinic is 45 kilometers away, and the Whittakers have no means of transport. They have no forms of entertainment besides sitting on the porch watching the few cars pass on the dirt road. Their existence is silent and without perspective. My first reaction was pure shock, Leiter admits in an interview. But then it hit me, how could a family in such extreme conditions remain completely invisible to the authorities for so long? The path to their home is literally a dirt track created by decades of use by a single family. When I finally arrived, I thought I was looking at a horror movie scene. The photographer says he initially struggled to comprehend he was looking at human beings. Ray was sitting on the porch, and honestly, my first thought was that it was some kind of sculpture or haunted doll. When he moved and made those sounds, I realized I was facing something I never imagined could exist. Leiter tried to establish basic communication but quickly realized the family's extreme limitations. Freddie was the only one who could form recognizable words, but even his answers were limited to yes, no, and a few loose words. I asked how old he was, and he answered a lot. I asked where he was born, and he pointed to the ground. The situation reveals deep systemic failures in American society. Raleigh County, where the Whittakers live, is one of the poorest and most neglected regions of Western Virginia. With a population of only 78,000 spread over 600 square kilometers, social services are scarce and overloaded. Internal documents from the Department of Social Services, obtained through Freedom of Information litigation, reveal local authorities were aware of the Whittaker situation for decades but consciously chose to ignore it. It was not ignorance, it was a conscious political decision to treat them as a problem that did not exist. The documents reveal at least 8 social workers' reports between 1985 and 2005 describing subhuman conditions on the property. Each report recommended immediate intervention, and each was filed without action by supervisors who considered the case intractable. Morrison, a social worker who worked in the region for 15 years, explains, there are hundreds of isolated families in these mountains living in precarious conditions. Resources are limited, and cases like the Whittakers require expert intervention that is simply not available in poor rural counties. The educational system also completely failed the family. Western Virginia Education Department records show that during the 1980s, truancy officers tried to force the children to attend school. All attempts were frustrated by family resistance and the children's physical and mental condition. The children arrived with a strong smell, unable to communicate properly. The other children were scared, and the teachers had no training to deal with such severe disabilities. Negligence was not just educational. Local newspaper the Charleston Gazette-Mail reported in 1995 and 2003 on at least 2 investigations by the Department of Social Services into improper living conditions on the property. Both investigations resulted in reports that were filed without any concrete action. The 1995 report described subhuman living conditions, absence of basic sanitation, evidence of medical neglect, and possible sexual abuse. The Whittakers exposed the hypocrisy of a society that prides itself on family values but completely abandons families that don't fit normative standards. The local community itself has an ambiguous relationship with them. Some neighbors show genuine compassion, bringing food and clothes occasionally. Others see them as a local shame to be hidden from outsiders, viewing the family's condition as a divine curse or payment for ancestral sins. If this family is like this, it is because God has a purpose we cannot understand. This fatalistic resignation stymied any attempt at external intervention for decades. The Whittaker family has not only been forgotten by the system, it was actively ignored by a community that preferred to treat it as invisible. The history of the Whittaker family transcends the sensationalism of extreme consanguinity. It speaks to American rural poverty, institutional negligence, failures in health and education systems, and the systematic abandonment of marginalized populations. Subsequent genetic studies have revealed the Whittakers are not an isolated case in Appalachia. What makes the Whittaker case unique is not the consanguinity itself, but the extreme temporal duration and the complete absence of external intervention, explains Dr. Bamshad. They represent a natural experiment on the limits of human survival in adverse genetic conditions. But this has also transformed the Whittakers into a kind of human zoo attraction. Morbid tourists began appearing on the property, taking pictures and videos as if they were animals on display. This additional exploitation raised complex ethical questions about consent and human dignity. Media attention brought some practical improvements. Donations from viewers allowed for minor house reforms, installation of a generator for basic electricity, a functional bathroom, and more regular access to medical care. Ray is now 70, Lorraine 65, and both suffer from chronic health problems. Timmy, 62, and Freddie, 60, show signs of accelerated aging. They are literally the last of their line, a family that has reproduced to the brink of extinction. But the Whittaker's story also serves as a warning. In the poorest rural regions of America, thousands of families live in conditions of extreme social, educational, and medical vulnerability. Geographic isolation combined with poverty and institutional negligence creates environments where similar tragedies can develop silently. Dr. Williams, a social anthropologist at the University of Virginia who has studied isolated Appalachian communities for 20 years, notes that the Whittaker family is not an anomaly. It is the extreme result of social trends affecting thousands of families in the region. Multidimensional poverty, cultural isolation, and government abandonment create ecosystems where human tragedies like this can be perpetuated for generations. Williams has documented at least 47 other families in Appalachia with significant histories of consanguinity, though none reaching the Whittaker's extreme levels. What we see is a vulnerability gradient, she explains. The Whittaker family represents the most extreme point of a spectrum of social neglect affecting the entire region. The parallels are disturbing. Families like the Fugits, known for blue skin caused by consanguinity, or the Hartwells, who suffer from dwarfism and hereditary cognitive disabilities, show that the Whittakers are not an isolated case. They are simply the most extreme example of a regional pattern of isolation and endogamy. Research driven by the Appalachian Health Initiative reveals that consanguinity rates in isolated mountain communities can be 15 to 20 times higher than national averages. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, who leads this initiative, states, "We're dealing with a public health crisis ignored for decades." The Whittaker family represents the most severe end point of what happens when geographic isolation combines with economic desperation and social abandonment. The true lesson of the Whittaker family is not in their deformed genetics, but in what their existence reveals about the deep failures of a society that refuses to care for its most vulnerable members. They are an uncomfortable mirror reflecting not only physical deformities but the moral and social deformities of a system that abandons those who need protection the most. Dr. Bennett offers a dark final perspective. From a purely scientific viewpoint, the Whittaker family represents what happens when natural selection is artificially suspended. Under natural conditions, individuals with so many genetic deficiencies would not survive to reproductive age. What kept this family alive was not their genes, but modern support systems. This persistence, however, comes at an immeasurable human cost. Each day for the Whittaker brothers is a struggle against limitations no human should face. Their existence is simultaneously a testimony to human resilience and a devastating accusation against a society that allows such suffering to be perpetuated. Today, as you watch this story comfortably at home with access to education, health, and opportunities, the Whittaker brothers remain in their home without electricity, without hope, without a future. They are ghosts of an America we prefer to pretend does not exist, hidden in the forgotten folds of a country that prides itself on opportunity for all. The Whittaker family will die in silence, as it lived. But its history will remain as a permanent testimony to what happens when a society decides some lives simply do not matter enough to be saved. They are the human price of institutionalized neglect, the genetic cost of social abandonment, and living proof that some tragedies are entirely avoidable if we only care enough to prevent them. Their lives are a question directed at our collective conscience. If a society is judged by how it treats its most vulnerable members, what does the existence of the Whittaker family say about who we really are? If you are not subscribed yet, subscribe now, because stories like this reveal truths that few have the courage to tell. If you've watched this far, it's because this story impacted you. Leave a comment saying, "I watched here," so I can get to know you and see who really follows the channel. Leave a like if this story moved you in any way. Share this video so more people understand the realities our society prefers to ignore.